My parents told me to pay money for my Golden Brothers family. My name is Michael, and I'm 22. I'm a college student, and I live at home, not too far from campus. From as early as I can remember, I've tried not to add to my parents' worries. I study hard, and I work part-time as a programmer so I can help out with expenses. Every month, I hand my parents $550 to cover my part of the rent and household bills. It's always been important to me that they see I'm responsible. I know they work hard, so I try to pull my weight. Until recently, my life was on track. I was saving up, little by little, hoping to start my own business one day. But things changed fast when my brother Chris moved in with his family. Chris is only a year older than me, but in our parents' eyes, he might as well be the golden child. He's always had this shine around him in their eyes, a confidence and charm that won everyone over, even when he'd mess up. He got into his fair share of trouble, from fights to skipping school, but somehow he always seemed to slide by without much consequence. He's got this charisma that makes people want to believe in him, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Meanwhile, I'd stayed quietly on the sidelines, taking a different path. I studied, worked, and did my best to earn a little praise, hoping one day my efforts would mean something to them. It's not that they didn't care for me. They did, but Chris just had this ability to command their full attention, something I couldn't quite capture. Chris married his high school girlfriend after she got pregnant, and our parents were thrilled, stepping in to help them get settled, even going as far as setting up a home for them. For a while, I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe he'll settle down and prove that he can be the reliable man they see in him. But that stability was short-lived. About a year ago, he announced that he'd started a successful business and promised big returns. I remember him sitting at the dinner table, talking about contracts worth millions, saying he'd soon buy a house in a posh neighborhood. My parents were ecstatic, nodding along, thrilled with pride. I sat there quietly, not saying much, a mix of disbelief and, if I'm honest, frustration. He painted such a perfect picture, and they seemed so eager to believe it. Meanwhile, I was working 20 hours a week on top of my classes and handing over more than half my paycheck just to help out. Chris and his family moved in not long after his big announcement. At first, I tried to be understanding. Family was family, after all. But the house quickly turned chaotic. With Chris, his wife, and their 2 young kids, the peaceful home I'd known was transformed into something unrecognizable. The mornings became a battle for bathroom time. The kitchen was constantly cluttered with toys and half-eaten snacks, and privacy became a distant memory. I'd be working on an assignment or a coding project, focused on the screen, and suddenly there'd be a toddler darting into my room, chasing a ball or looking for a toy. No knock, no warning, just loud giggles and a tiny whirlwind disrupting my thoughts. At first, I thought I could adapt. I tried closing my door, setting boundaries, explaining that I needed time and space to focus. But Chris and his wife would just laugh it off. "They're kids, Mike. What do you expect?" he'd say, grinning like it was the funniest thing in the world. His wife, Jen, would add, "They look up to you. It's cute." Only, it wasn't so cute when it became impossible to study or work. I try to bring it up casually, hoping they'd understand, but I was usually brushed off. Jen would say, "Oh, you can always go to the library if it's that important," or Chris would make a joke about how I was always so serious. Then there were the endless favors they'd ask of me. Little things, maybe, but they piled up quickly. Watching the kids while they ran out, helping Chris fix something on his laptop, picking up groceries if I was heading out. It was never anything huge, but it was constant. And there was never a thank you. Never a sign that they appreciated the extra effort. I started feeling more like a convenient helper than a member of the family. And no matter how patient I tried to be, a resentment started building up inside me, one that was getting harder and harder to ignore. As the weeks went by, the tension in the house grew, at least for me. Chris and his family seemed to settle in comfortably, while I felt like I was slowly becoming invisible in my own home. The breaking point came one evening when my mom knocked on my door. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Michael, since expenses have gone up with everyone here, your dad and I think you should contribute a little more each month," she said with a tone that felt more like a decision than a suggestion. I was stunned. I already handed over more than half my paycheck, never complained, and now, suddenly, I was expected to contribute even more? It didn't feel fair, especially considering that Chris wasn't paying a cent. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Why should I pay more if Chris doesn't contribute anything?" She hesitated, just for a second, but then her expression hardened. "Chris is trying to get his business off the ground, and he has a family to think about. You don't have that kind of responsibility." I wanted to argue, to explain that my responsibilities were just as real, that I was trying to build my own future too. But before I could get the words out, she turned and left, as if the conversation was already over. The next day, my dad approached me with the same request. Only this time, he barely gave me a chance to respond. "Look, Mike, we're all making sacrifices here," he said in a tone that left no room for argument. "It's just what's best for the family right now." There was that phrase, "for the family." It seemed to apply to everyone except me. After that conversation with my dad, a new tension seemed to settle over the house, stretching through every interaction. I'd go to class, clock in my hours at work, then come home only to feel like a guest in my own family. This place, the one that had been my constant, no longer felt like mine. Every day, I'd walk through the door to hear Chris's kids yelling or music blaring from the TV, and I'd feel this subtle ache, like the house itself had turned its back on me. I was mentally and physically exhausted, but to everyone else, I was just a fixture, someone who'd always be there, no questions asked. One evening, after another long day, I came home to find my mom in the kitchen, setting the table for dinner. She moved about with practiced ease, humming softly, her focus on folding napkins and arranging utensils as if the task itself was something precious. I watched her for a moment, gathering the words I knew I needed to say. The weight of the past few weeks bore down on me, and I knew I couldn't keep holding this in. Finally, I stepped into the light and cleared my throat. "Mom, can I talk to you for a minute?" She glanced up, her expression softening slightly before it returned to that now familiar look of distraction. "Of course, Michael. What's on your mind?" Her tone was warm, but there was an edge of exhaustion there too, one I wasn't sure was directed at me or just the world around her. I took a steadying breath. "I can't pay any more than I already do," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "I've been giving you $550 a month, on top of all the extra help around the house. I just can't do any more." For a moment, she looked almost stunned, her hands frozen mid-fold on a napkin. Then, slowly, she set it down and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "Michael," she began, her voice softer than usual, as though she were trying to keep her patience in check. "We're not asking for much. Just a bit more to help everyone get by. Times are tough, and everyone has to pitch in." I held her gaze, trying not to let my frustration show. "Mom, I'm doing my part. I'm giving more than half of what I make. Chris doesn't contribute anything, and yet I'm the one you're asking to sacrifice more. How is that fair?" Her face darkened, her expression slipping from disappointment into something colder, harder. For a moment, I thought she might respond, might try to explain or offer some small reassurance. But instead, she just shook her head, letting out a quiet, bitter sigh. "You know, Michael," she said, more to herself than to me, "I never thought you'd be so selfish." The word stung, as sharp and cutting as a slap. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, but before I could respond, she brushed past me, as if the conversation were already over. She didn't turn back or offer any kind of comfort, just muttered something about doing what's necessary as she continued setting the table. After that, an uneasy silence grew between us, thick and suffocating. My dad, too, barely acknowledged me, his polite distance more unsettling than any argument could have been. At dinner, I'd sit at the edge of the table, listening to them talk around me, the conversations flowing as if I weren't there at all. Every laugh, every smile exchanged over the table felt like a reminder of my isolation, like I was no longer part of their world. In those moments, sitting alone at the table while my family shared stories and laughter, I felt a hollow ache settling in my chest. This was my family, the people I'd spent my whole life with. And yet, it was becoming clearer every day that I'd never truly been part of their circle. No matter what I did, no matter how much I sacrificed, it would never be enough to change that. As the days passed, the tension in the house turned into something thicker, something that felt almost permanent. Every time I came home, I could sense it, this growing divide between me and everyone else. Chris's family had fully settled in by now, treating the house as if it had always been theirs. The change felt gradual at first, like an annoyance I could learn to live with, but slowly it became suffocating, creeping into every corner of my life. One evening, I came home after a long day of back-to-back classes and a shift at work, hoping to squeeze in a few hours of study time before bed. My mind was already frayed from trying to juggle everything, and all I wanted was a bit of quiet to focus. But as I walked through the front door, I was greeted by chaos. Toys were strewn across the floor, plastic cars and dolls scattered across the entryway, and the TV was blaring from the living room. Jen was cooking in the kitchen, pots and pans clanging as she hurried to get dinner ready. Chris sat at the dining table with his feet up, scrolling on his phone, oblivious to the noise and mess around him. I tried to make myself invisible, slipping through the scene and heading toward my room. But just as I reached my door, I heard Chris call out, "Hey, Mike, you mind watching the kids for a bit? Jen and I need to run out for groceries." His voice was casual, like he was asking for the smallest favor. I turned to face him, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Actually, I was hoping to get some studying done tonight," I said, hoping he'd take the hint. Chris just grinned, as if I'd made a joke. "Come on, man, it'll only be an hour. They love hanging out with you. Besides, it'll give you a break from all that serious studying." He said it with a laugh, like he genuinely thought he was doing me a favor. I opened my mouth to argue, to say something, anything, to make him realize that I couldn't keep dropping everything at a moment's notice. But before I could get the words out, he'd already grabbed his coat, calling out to Jen, "Let's go. Mike's got it covered." Jen shot me a quick, thankful smile as she followed Chris out the door, leaving me standing there with two kids who were now looking up at me expectantly. I sighed, forcing a smile for their sake, and led them into the living room, setting aside my laptop and the stack of notes I'd been carrying. The kids settled in, playing with their toys and asking me to join them. I did my best to keep up, but my mind kept drifting back to my unfinished work, the deadline ticking closer with every minute I spent here. An hour passed, then another, and my frustration grew, fueled by the realization that I'd lost another evening of valuable time. By the time Chris and Jen returned, it was well past 8. They breezed in with bags of groceries, chatting and laughing like they'd had a relaxing evening out. Chris dropped his bags on the kitchen counter and threw me a quick, careless "thanks, bro," before heading off to his room, leaving me standing there, staring after him. No apology, no offer to take over so I could finally get to my own responsibilities, just a casual assumption that I'd be there whenever they needed a break. It was as if my time didn't matter, as if the life I was working so hard to build was nothing more than an inconvenience to them. The resentment that had been simmering for weeks finally started to boil over, and I realized with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before that I couldn't keep doing this. As I picked up my things and retreated to my room, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I was done waiting for things to change, done hoping that my family would see the toll this was taking on me. They'd made it clear time and time again that my needs came second or third or not at all. And as much as it hurt, I knew then that I had to start thinking about what was best for me, even if it meant leaving the people I'd once relied on the most. After that night, I started making plans to find a way out. The idea had been brewing for a while, but now it felt urgent. It hurt. The thought of leaving the place I called home for years, but I couldn't keep living like a ghost in my own family. I needed a space where I wasn't overlooked, somewhere I could breathe and feel at peace. But I knew leaving would be a huge shift, so I didn't want to rush. I started searching for apartments whenever I had a spare moment. Rent was high, and most places were out of my budget. At one point, I was almost ready to give up, thinking I'd have to stick it out and maybe find a way to push through the discomfort at home. Then, almost by chance, a friend from college reached out. He was in a similar situation. He'd been looking to move out too, but couldn't quite swing a place on his own. When I explained what I was going through, he immediately offered to split a small apartment he'd found near campus. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom on the edge of town, but it was affordable and within biking distance of school and work. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, turning the idea over in my mind. It was tempting to leave without telling anyone, just to pack up and vanish. The resentment had been building up inside me for so long that the thought of walking out without a word felt almost satisfying. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. My parents had always depended on me, whether they acknowledged it or not, and disappearing overnight would make things harder for them. Still, I was resolved. I didn't have the words yet, but I knew I'd have to say something to my mom and dad soon. The way things were going, I could feel the final threads of patience slipping, and I didn't want to wait until things reached a breaking point. For once, I'd put myself first and make a choice that felt right for me. The next morning, I got up early, more determined than ever. The house was quiet. Everyone was still asleep. So I went to the kitchen to make myself some coffee and think through what I'd say. There was a lot to consider, and I wanted to handle it as calmly as possible. After all, I'd be breaking the news to my family that I was leaving, a decision that would likely go over about as well as a thunderstorm at a picnic. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter, replaying the past few months in my mind. The noise, the constant interruptions, the endless favors that were more like expectations. The resentment bubbled up again, and I felt that familiar ache of being overlooked. I couldn't help but think back to how things used to be before Chris moved in. The house had been quieter, simpler, and for the most part, I'd felt at ease. Now it was hard to believe it was the same place. When I heard footsteps coming down the hall, I braced myself. It was my dad, his usual morning routine evident in the way he walked straight for the coffee maker, barely acknowledging me with a nod before pouring himself a mug. The silence was awkward, but I wasn't ready to speak yet, so I just nodded back and took my coffee to the corner of the kitchen table. Dad sat down across from me, flipping through a newspaper without a word. For a while, we just sat there, both of us immersed in our own thoughts. Finally, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. "Dad," I started, the words feeling heavy as I forced them out. "I'm thinking about moving out. I found a place with a friend." He didn't look up right away, and I wondered if he'd heard me at all. After a long pause, he set down the newspaper, his face unreadable. "You want to move out?" he asked, his tone calm but distant, like he was mulling over the implications. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think it'd be best for everyone, really." I glanced around the kitchen, my gaze settling on the pile of toys in the corner, the mess of cereal boxes on the counter. The signs of Chris's family were everywhere, small reminders that I was no longer a priority here. Dad let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting around the room as if he, too, was seeing all the changes that had settled into our lives. "Your mom's not going to like this," he said finally, his voice soft. There was a hint of disappointment, maybe even a trace of sadness, but it was faint, buried beneath a layer of resignation. I nodded, bracing myself for what was to come. "I figured," I replied, trying to sound casual even though my chest felt tight. This was my family, and yet I felt like I had to justify my own need for space, for peace, for some kind of respect. It hurt, but I knew this was the only way forward. That evening, I found my mom in the living room, folding a pile of laundry while the TV played softly in the background. It was one of those rare, quiet moments in the house, and I took a deep breath, hoping she'd be more open to listening than my dad had been. "Mom," I began, hesitating when she didn't look up right away. I felt my heart pounding, the weight of years of small sacrifices and unspoken words pressing down on me. "I need to talk to you about something important." She glanced up, her hands pausing mid-fold. "What's going on, Michael?" she asked, giving me that familiar look, the one I remembered from my childhood when she'd be concerned about my grades or my health. It almost made me reconsider, but I knew I couldn't back out now. "I've decided to move out," I said, trying to sound confident. "I found a place with a friend. I think it's just time." Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of surprise or sadness, she looked tired. She sighed, setting down the shirt she'd been folding. "Michael, why would you want to do that? We're a family here. You don't have to leave." I swallowed, feeling the familiar frustration rise in my chest. "Mom, it's been hard. I can't focus on school or work with everything going on here. Chris's kids are always around, and there's no space left for me." Her face softened, but not in the way I'd hoped. Michael, Chris, and his family need us right now. They're going through a lot, and your father and I can't turn them away. You know that." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I get that, but it feels like I'm the only one expected to keep sacrificing. I pay rent, I help out, and I'm constantly doing favors for them. It's like I'm more of a guest than family. She frowned, her expression shifting to something colder. "That's not fair. You're acting like we don't appreciate you at all, and that's simply not true." I tried to hold her gaze, but the frustration was making it hard. "Mom, it's not about appreciation. I just need space. I need to feel like I can focus on my own life, too." She looked away, her hands resuming their folding as if the conversation was already over. "Well, if that's how you feel, then I can't stop you," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hurt. "Just don't expect us to understand why you'd leave your family when they need you most." The words hit like a punch, the kind of wound that sinks in slowly. She'd made up her mind, just like always, and any attempt to explain myself further felt useless. The message was clear. In her eyes, leaving was a betrayal. And as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't stay. Not like this. The following days passed in a blur as I made preparations to leave. I'd already told my friend I'd take the apartment, so the next step was packing up my things, little by little, so that no one would really notice. I couldn't shake the feeling that if my family saw me putting my life into boxes, they'd try to convince me to stay, or worse, tell me how selfish I was being all over again. My room, which had once felt like a refuge, was now filled with the quiet rustle of packing tape and the shuffle of cardboard boxes. Each item I packed seemed to carry its own weight, a small reminder of the life I'd been trying to build under this roof. Books, clothes, my computer setup for work and school. It was surprising how quickly my entire world could fit into a few boxes. It felt strange, like I was erasing myself from my own home, one item at a time. In the middle of packing up my desk, there was a soft knock at the door. Startled, I looked up to see my dad standing there, leaning against the doorframe. He'd never been one for long talks, but something about the way he was looking at me told me he had something to say. "Packing already," he said, his eyes scanning the half-filled boxes around the room. "Yeah," I replied, setting down a stack of notebooks. "I figured I'd get a head start." He nodded, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Look, Mike, I get that things haven't been easy around here. Your mom and I, we put a lot on you. We're just trying to do what we think is right, you know? Family's complicated." I searched his face for any hint of understanding, a sign that maybe he saw how much this was hurting me. "I get it, Dad, but I need this. I need space to focus, to feel like I have control over my life." He looked away, his gaze falling on the stack of boxes by the door. "It's just your mom, she takes things hard. She's always wanted to keep the family together, especially with Chris going through what he is." The word stung, a reminder of that familiar priority. Chris. No matter what I did, his needs seemed to eclipse my own, his struggles more worthy of sacrifice. I wanted to tell my dad how lonely that made me feel, how much it hurt to be treated like a background character in my own family, but the words just wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know, Dad, but I can't keep bending over backward for everyone else. I have my own life to build." For a moment, he looked like he might say something more, but he just gave a slow nod. "All right, then," he said quietly. "Just take care of yourself out there." And with that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. I was left standing in the middle of my half-packed room, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The silence settled around me, and I realized that, for the first time, I felt certain that leaving was the right decision. The night I left, I waited until everyone was asleep. It wasn't that I wanted to sneak away, but I didn't trust myself to keep it together if I had to say goodbye face to face. I didn't want any final confrontations, no guilt trips or last-minute arguments. I needed this exit to be as smooth and quiet as possible. I double-checked everything, making sure I had my essentials packed, and left the boxes of my less important stuff to pick up later with my friend. The house was still, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the dark. I walked down the hall with my bag slung over my shoulder, past the doors that held a lifetime of memories. My parents' room, closed and dark. The kids' room, a soft night light glowing from under the door. When I reached Chris and Jen's door, I paused. I could hear the soft murmur of the TV and a faint laugh from Jen, some late-night sitcom playing in the background. For a second, I wondered if Chris even realized the impact he'd had on my decision to leave. Did he ever notice or care that his presence had slowly pushed me out of my own life here? I doubted it. Chris had always been the center, with everyone else orbiting around him. With a small sigh, I kept moving, heading down the stairs toward the front door. My heart pounded as I turned the knob and stepped outside, the cool night air brushing against my face. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking back at the house, the windows dark and silent. This had been my home, and leaving it felt surreal, like I was cutting away a part of myself. As I took one last look, my mind drifted to my parents. I wish things had been different. I wish they'd seen me, not just as someone to fill in the gaps, but as their son, with his own dreams and struggles. But that wish felt hollow now, too late to change anything. Without another glance, I turned and headed down the driveway, the weight of my bag on my shoulder feeling strangely light compared to the weight I was finally leaving behind. The next morning, I woke up in my new apartment, the thin light of dawn slipping through blinds that barely covered the window. Everything around me felt unfamiliar. The hollow echo of an empty room, the mattress on the floor where I'd crashed the night before, the faint smell of paint and dust. It wasn't much, just a small two-bedroom place, but it was quiet. That silence was like a balm after the endless noise of home, the constant demands, the feeling of being overshadowed. Here, it was just me, my things, and the potential of a fresh start. I lay there for a few minutes, letting the newness of it all sink in. There was a strange sense of freedom that mingled with the underlying ache of leaving. As much as I knew this was the right decision, I still felt a pang of loss. I left my family behind, a family I'd spent years trying to connect with, trying to fit into. But no amount of wishing would change what had already happened. After a while, I got up and started unpacking, taking my time as I sorted through my things. The quiet was almost disorienting, but I savored it, knowing this was my space, a place where I could focus on my own life without interruption. The room might have been empty, but it felt full of potential, as if I were finally on the brink of something I'd been chasing for years. Around noon, as I was arranging my desk setup, my phone buzzed with a call from my mom. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, uncertain whether I should answer. Part of me expected her to be calling out of worry, maybe even an apology or some sign that she missed me. But the minute I picked up, her tone was clipped, direct. "Michael, where are you? Why aren't you home?" "I'm not coming back, Mom," I replied, feeling a mix of nervousness and resolve as I spoke. "I told you I needed space. I moved out last night." There was a pause, just long enough to let her words sink in. "Michael, you've really let us down. Your father and I expected better. We needed you here to help." "Help with what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I planned. "Paying more rent so Chris doesn't have to? Babysitting his kids while I try to study? I've done my part, Mom." Her voice dropped, disappointment laced with a trace of hurt. "You're being selfish, Michael. You're leaving us to struggle when we counted on you." I took a deep breath, clenching the phone tightly. "Mom, I can't keep sacrificing my future so Chris can keep getting handouts. I need to do this for me." The silence on the other end was thick, heavy, but I didn't waver. She muttered something about betraying the family, and then, just like that, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment, the ache settling back into my chest, but this time it felt different. I'd held my ground. I'd put myself first, and despite the sting of her words, I felt a small, stubborn spark of pride. In the days that followed, things settled into a strange kind of normal. I was adjusting to my new life, slowly filling the apartment with my things, building a routine that was completely my own. No one barged into my room, no kids ran wild through the halls, and I didn't have to answer to anyone. It was just me, my work, my studies, and the quiet I'd been craving. But even though I'd physically left, it felt like my family hadn't fully let me go. My mom's calls kept coming, each one filled with a different mix of guilt, frustration, and sadness. At first, I'd let them go to voicemail, not sure I could handle hearing the disappointment in her voice. But after a while, the messages became harder to ignore. Her words echoed in my mind, laced with a kind of quiet hurt that I knew all too well. Finally, after several days, I picked up one of her calls. "Michael," she said, her tone more pleading than angry this time. "This isn't right. We're family. Families are supposed to stick together. How can you just leave us like this?" "Mom," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, "I didn't leave you. I left a situation that wasn't fair to me. I was being treated like a live-in helper, not a son." She sighed, and I could almost picture her rubbing her temples, the way she did whenever she was trying to rein in her frustration. "But you know your brother is going through a rough time. Chris has kids to think about, a family to support. You're young, you don't have those same responsibilities yet." Her words stung, the familiar refrain that Chris's needs always seemed to come first, no matter the cost to me. But I wasn't going to let it slide this time. "Mom, I get that you want to help him. But what about me? I'm trying to build a future, too. I need a chance to stand on my own." There was a pause, longer this time, as if she hadn't considered my side of things. "Michael, you know we love you," she finally said, her voice softer now. "But it's hard. You just don't understand the pressure we're under. We're trying to do what's best for everyone." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own frustration in check. "I do understand, Mom, but I can't keep sacrificing my own life because Chris needs help. I need to do what's best for me now. I hope you can understand that." She didn't respond right away, and I could feel the weight of the distance growing between us, a silent acknowledgement that our family dynamic might never be the same. After a long moment, she let out a small sigh. "Well, I hope you're happy, Michael. I really do." With that, she hung up, and I sat there, feeling the finality of it all. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the first step in creating the life I needed. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of real hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally build something that was truly mine.